read, or some of the students read, but there are two books that came before that, and the first one was When Stars Rain Down. And it tells the story of a young African-American girl who at the time would have either been referred to as colored or Negro, who was raised in a rural town in Georgia, a made-up town, Parsons, Georgia. And this young girl, Opal, was a proud housekeeper. She worked with her grandmother at the local at a local family's home, and I wrote that book for a number of reasons. One, because I grew up with cousins and aunts who were housekeepers or who were nannies, and it was almost every summer when I was out of school, I would be with one of those women when they would go and take care of those white families. And I saw a side of what it meant to be a domestic worker in ways that I had not seen in other books. And I remember Toni Morrison, I believe it was, that said, if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, write it yourself. And so I said to myself, I want to write a book that honors the women, primarily the women in my family. Now, my father was a Navy veteran, but when he got out of the Navy, there were no jobs available for him, so he went back to picking cotton on his family's farm where he was, they were sharecroppers. But then later on, he and his daddy would sometimes work at parties in the local community. My grandfather, Mr. Lee Jackson, and he insisted that everyone from the lowest grandchild to the oldest person in the family call him Mr. Lee Jackson. Mr. Lee would often work, he and Daddy would work some of the parties in the local community. Well, one party in particular that my granddaddy, Grandpa Lee, worked was a Klan gathering. So imagine this, these men were all coming together to celebrate, and my granddaddy had to walk through with the trays of food and pass it out to men that were wearing Klan robes. That's one story about Grandpa Lee. Another story, when my daddy first came back from serving in World War II, I had an older father. Daddy was in his 50s when he adopted me. Daddy was very proud to serve his country. That Navy uniform meant everything to him, and from what I've been told, he would wear it everywhere. We came around to election, or he came around to the first election after serving his country, and he went to register to vote, thinking, I've served my country well. Surely they're going to allow me to vote. But Daddy walks towards the polling place, and the men in the community were already ready for him and others like him. There was a row of white men, 2 rows, all of them with shotguns, saying, you can walk in, but you won't walk out. Daddy didn't register to vote that day. My Grandpa Lee also went to go register and vote, and I was talking to the students about the tax that he had to pay, and thinking that once he paid that tax it would be sufficient. But he walked in, paid his money to the clerk, and the clerk said, well, Lee, there's one more step. And so she pulls out a jar about yay big, and it was filled with jelly beans. And she said, Lee, if you can guess how many jelly beans are in that jar, you can register to vote. Well, my grandpa was illiterate. He didn't even know how to sign his name properly. So the idea that he was going to be able to guess how many jelly beans were in that jar was ludicrous. But he didn't give up. He went back home. He bought himself a jar about the same as what he saw, bought some jelly beans, told the grandkids, you fill that thing up with jelly beans, and then I want you to count each one of them, and I'm going to keep going to that place until they let me vote. I wish there was a happily ever after to this story. I really do. But Grandpa Lee, as far as I know, did not ever get a chance to vote because, of course, he was never able to guess how many jelly beans were in that jar. So you're like, why is she taking us all around the world and back again with that story? I tell that story to really tell you why these stories are so important to me and why they're more than just something to entertain a reader. They're even more than just to educate a reader about our past. It's to let you know that these incidents happened in a time where there are people still walking around that have memories of that time. I'm a historical fiction writer, but there are people that participated in that history still alive in my hometown. They're older now. Some of them don't have much longer. But some of those men that held those shotguns to keep my daddy from voting are still alive. I don't know about the men that did what they did or the woman that did what she did to my Grandpa Lee or Mr. Lee, but history is still alive and breathing and walking with us. So I take these stories that I write very seriously, and I'm always inspired when a historian gives me a little pat on the back, because I always thought I wanted to be a historian. But when I tried to take a history or class or two, the history professor, he figured me out pretty quick. He says, you like making up stories more than you like telling true history. And then after some years, I realized I could have the best of both worlds by writing historical fiction. So these stories are all set in the same fictional universe of Parsons, Georgia, beginning in 1936. And the last book, Homeward, is in the 1960s, the early days of the civil rights movement in Georgia, and also the early days of the Vietnam War. Even though the draft had not happened yet, there were still, in fact, quite a few black men that were volunteering to go fight in this war. For many of them, it meant more money than what they were getting in farming. But it also, like my daddy thought, was another opportunity to prove their allegiance and their loyalty to this country, believing that if I fight for this country will fight for me.